I wanted to take a moment or two to talk about the unfolding scandal involving Congressman Matt Gaetz, the Republican House member from Florida, because I think it raises some very important and very fascinating questions about a whole variety of topics, including how we think about due process and the assumption of guilt, about left-wing and libertarian conceptions of morality and how some of those issues have evolved and changed over time, and how it is that we think about the principle of consensual private adult behavior and how that too has changed over time. So obviously this is a very sensitive issue. A lot of people are simply afraid to talk about it because the minute you do anything other than scream pedophile at Matt Gaetz, you yourself will be called either a pedophile or somebody who has sympathy for pedophilia. And I generally don't speak to people who are engaged in that kind of muck, and I don't intend to now. So I do want to begin by talking just about the facts of what we actually know and what we don't know. And it should go without saying, though I know it doesn't, that I am not defending Matt Gaetz, nor am I here to argue that he did nothing wrong, precisely because the evidence relevant to that question has not been publicly presented, either in a judicial proceeding or even publicly. There are a lot of allegations swirling around, but because there's no evidence, it would be irrational to make assumptions one way or the other about whether one believes that he did things like had sex with women under the age of 18, whether that was illegal, whether he paid women for sex, whether he used drugs with them or alone. There's no evidence on any of those questions. Obviously, there may be one day when there's a mountain of indisputable evidence proving that all or some of those allegations are true, but that is not yet the case. None of that evidence has been presented, and therefore nothing I'm talking about has anything to do with my views on whether he's will ultimately be determined to be guilty of these allegations, because that evidence is not available. So let me just talk about what is known. I think it's very important to remember that this story broke on March 30th when the New York Times published an article that did not report that Congressman Gaetz, has been charged with, let alone convicted of, any crimes. They reported that there was an investigation ongoing to determine whether he has committed any crimes. This is what that article says, and there's been almost nothing in the way of evidence that has emerged since this article. This is pretty much the universe of what we know. There's a little bit that has emerged, and I'll talk about that, but still, this is more or less the full extent of what is known about Congressman Gaetz in this matter. Quote, a Justice Department investigation into Representative Matt Gaetz and an indicted Florida politician is focusing on their involvement with multiple women who were recruited online for sex and received cash payments, according to people close to the investigation and text messages and payment receipts reviewed by the New York Times. The Justice Department inquiry is also examining whether Mr. Gaetz had sex with the 17-year-old girl and whether she received anything of material value, according to 4 people familiar with the investigation. The New York Times article noted, quite importantly, quote, no charges have been brought against Mr. Gaetz, and the extent of his criminal exposure is unclear. So I think it's extremely important to note that he has not been charged with any crimes, let alone convicted, nor has any evidence pertaining to the veracity of these potential allegations been publicly presented. And yet what we find is that the way many people in the media are discussing this case, and the way many even leading politicians who have animosity towards him are doing so, is exactly the opposite. They're asserting that there are charges against him. Let me share with you this video clip shared by the Vox video dunce Aaron Ruper about Liz Cheney, the new liberal hero and icon, on Face the Nation this morning. Here is what Congressman Cheney said when asked about this matter.
Just said, it's up to your party to take responsibility for Congressman Matt Gaetz, who, as you know, is undergoing an ethics investigation. Are you ready to call for his resignation? Or are you going to wait?
You know, as the mother of daughters, the charges certainly are sickening.
Okay, The charges are sickening. There are no charges against Congressman Gaetz. That is not a semantic matter. That is a crucial matter. The government has not alleged that he's done anything wrong. They're investigating that question. And yet, as a result of Congresswoman Cheney's false statement, you now have the standard tabloids like the Daily Beast with headlines saying things like Liz Cheney on Matt Gaetz, quote, "The charges certainly are sickening." There are no charges. There's a leaked claim that there is an investigation, and we should await the conclusion of that investigation, or at least evidence presented prior to its conclusion before making assessments or assumptions about whether what he did was wrong at all, let alone illegal or immoral. That should not be a controversial proposition. And yet, just like free speech, there are many people, especially in the liberal faction of American politics, who simply no longer believe in due process. They don't care whether these charges are true, whether there's evidence for them. They have concluded and convicted him based on leaked allegations of an investigation and are now essentially referring to him as a pedophile, and anyone who even raises these issues that I'm raising as being an apologist for that behavior. Now let's talk about the state of the law in the United States pertaining to this case, because the most damaging allegation by far that has been surfaced as part of this investigation is that the Justice Department is examining whether he had sex with a girl who was not 18, but 17. Now, it is very important to note what is the state of the age of consent laws in the United States. Doesn't matter if you agree with these and think they're good. It doesn't matter if you think they're bad and should be changed. I'm just talking about what the state of the law is. In 37 states in the United States, including the District of Columbia, where Congressman Gaetz obviously spends a lot of time as a congressman, the age of consent, meaning the age at which a person is deemed capable of fully and legally consenting to sex under any circumstances and with anyone, regardless of age or anything else, is not 18 years old, but is 16 or 17. That is what the law in the overwhelming majority of jurisdictions in the United States has decided and concluded is when a person is capable of consenting meaningfully to sexual activity with another consenting adult. Only in 12 states, only in 12 of the 50 states in the District of Columbia is the age of consent 18. So this assumption that a 17-year-old girl should be treated as a child and that any sex with a 17-year-old girl is inherently criminal or immoral is not the judgment of the overwhelming majority of states in every region of the country, which has decided that the age of consent law is 16 or 17 and it's legal to have sex with someone of that age, no matter the age of the other person. That's just the law. That's not my judgment. That's the state of the law. Now, it does happen to be the case that in Florida, the state that Congressman Gaetz represents and where he resides, the age of consent law is 18. And obviously, if Congressman Gaetz engaged in behavior that is illegal in the jurisdiction where he was, he ought to be treated like every other person. He's not special. He's not entitled to any privileges or immunities by virtue of his being a member of Congress, at least with regard to allegations like this. And so the question of whether he did something illegal is something that is just a question of law. There needs to be evidence that he actually had sex with somebody who was a minor, or that he paid a woman, regardless of her age, 30, 40, 50, 18, in order to have sex with him, because prostitution, regardless of the age of the person you're paying, is also illegal by both parties, by the person who's being paid and by the person who's paying. There's also questions of whether he engaged in drug use, such as ecstasy and other drugs, which also is illegal in every jurisdiction in the United States, which would also be illegal. But I want to separate the legal question, which is actually quite easy, right? If he did those things, it's clearly illegal, from the question of morality, whether it's consistent with leftist or liberal or libertarian or even conservative political ideology to view these acts not as illegal, but as immoral, these moral judgments that are being cast. Now, I also should hasten to add that Congressman Gaetz has vehemently denied all of these allegations, including that he ever paid for sex, to have sex with any woman, and or that he had sex with a minor under 17. And again, there's no evidence that's been presented on the question of the 17-year-old. The New York Times and other outlets have presented some evidence in the form of Venmo transactions, cash apps that might be suggestive of the fact that he actually sent money to bring women to him or to pay for women to have sex, although none of that is proven. But that is the state of the law and the state of the evidence as we know it. It's extremely sparse, the state of the evidence in terms of what he did or didn't do. And you wouldn't know that by listening to virtually everybody who talks about this, where his guilt has already been assumed and he's essentially already convicted, not just as a patron of prostitutes and a user of illegal drugs, but as a pedophile as well. And these are the questions I want to explore briefly.